And then the government built the largest detention center in the world and rounded into it thousands of refugees.
They were insane. They called for first strike plans, which was by order of President Eisenhower. He didn't want any plan for limited war of any kind with the Soviet Union under any circumstances.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on over 30 cable stations from Maine and Vermont down to New York City. On the internet at thestruggle.org. Today, anti-black racism in Israel, the latest about Ahed Tamimi, the accident in Hawaii, a sit-in in Steny Hoyer's office, and Mark Bray about last year's inauguration and the question of violence. Israel is racist not only towards Palestinians, but black Africans as well. 80,000 Africans fled horrific conditions at home and made it to Israel. The Israeli government will give none of them refugee status. Israel did sign the convention relating to the status of refugees, but just ignores it. David Sheen, in this video, explains.
You go to Israel, the blacks are just treated like dogs.
And is that right? Shouldn't we take a stand for what's wrong and be the change and the difference?
I don't want to change the culture.
You have probably heard right now in the year 2018, Africans, men, women and children are being sold at slave auctions in Libya. What you may not have heard is that Israel, the recipient of more US aid than any other country in the world, is also putting tens of thousands of Africans at risk of torture at the hands of those very slave traders. How did these refugees come to find themselves in Israel to begin with? And why is Israel now experiencing them all?
First of all, Israel is in Africa, connected to Africa, Northeast Africa. And as African people flee the dictatorship, oppressing them, ethnically cleansing them, they fled to every direction, including northeast to Israel. For those fled to Israel believed its claim to be democracy, and so that a state supposedly established to provide a safe haven for refugees would understand them and grant them asylum.
But they were wrong. In 2012, Israel built a high-tech fence on its border, cutting the country off from the rest of African continent to ensure no more refugees could enter to the country. And once completed, the government set into the task of forcing out the 65,000 of African refugees that had already managed to make it to the country. At the first, Israel feared what the world would say if it sent this refugee right back to the torture they fled from. So, instead of deporting them, it announced an official policy of make their life miserable in order to drive them all out.
Hundreds of Israeli chief rabbis issued a joint religious edict decreeing that it is a sin against God to rent apartments to African refugees. Israel's political leaders basically accused the Africans of being incorrigible criminals and of spreading diseases. And for years, the government outright refused to examine the refugee request. When it finally began to, it earned itself the distinction of having a higher refugee rejection rate than any other country in the world, over 99%.
And then the government built the largest detention center in the world and rounded into it thousands of refugees off the streets of Tel Aviv and other Israeli cities. All this in order to make their lives miserable so that they would buckle to the pressure, relent, grudgingly relent, and agree to self-deport back to Africa. In this way, Netanyahu managed to ethnically cleanse the country of between a third and one half of all African refugees in just 5 years.
All this was bad enough, but now an all-new evil spirit is sweeping across the globe, buoyed by a worldwide wave of white supremacy. Netanyahu now realizes that it's no longer necessary to coerce consent from these African refugees in order to deport them. Netanyahu's new plan is to simply round up the remaining 35,000 African refugees and physically force them out of the country. If any refugee refuses to leave Israel, Israel will jail them for life. In December, the measure passed in the Israeli parliament with a large majority, and the country's Supreme Court gave the policy its stamp of approval.
If Israel is allowed to expel its remaining African refugees, this will send a clear message to the European Union that it's legitimate for any country to adopt anti-refugee rules and keep out Black and brown people that are fleeing for their lives without even a sense of shame.
Now, let's not pretend that Israel is some kind of safe haven for Black folks. In recent years, the government racist rhetoric has led to a lot of vigilante violence against this community. African refugees have been murdered by Israeli lynch mob across the countries. Even the babies of African refugees, they have been violently attacked. In Tel Aviv, a kindergarten was firebombed, and a 1-year-old baby was stabbed in the head. No Israeli has ever been sentenced to jail for any of these savage hate crimes.
But the fate that awaits these refugees if they are forced out of Israel will be far worse. Israel has bribed the government of Rwanda with tens of millions of dollars to agree to take in the refugees that Israel expels. But the refugees aren't granted status there. Instead, their documents are confiscated and they are quickly forced to leave the country and begin their search for safe haven all over again, from scratch. Seeking protection in Europe, they are falling into captivity in Libya, where they are tortured and raped, mutilated and murdered.
Because Israel is so heavily dependent upon U.S. support,
American citizens are actually in position
to end this ethnic cleansing before it's completed.
Out of fear of offending supporters of Israel,
the mainstream media refuses to report critically
on the country's race wars.
But we can help circumvent this censorship
by sharing this video and others
about Israel's horrific treatment of African refugees.
Let your family, friends, and community leaders know how you feel
about the racism you are supporting with your tax dollars,
and urge them to join you to speak out against it.
If you are disgusted by the return of slavery,
don't just get angry, get active.
Get active.
Get active.
And do something to stop even more Black people being sold into bondage.
Today,
in
2018.
You go to Israel, the blacks are just treated like dogs.
Is that right? Shouldn't we take a stand for what's wrong?
To summarize, in recent years, Netanyahu has made life so unbearable for the refugees that half have voluntarily left the country. And now in April, Netanyahu will forcibly throw out the rest or make them go to jail forever. The British paper The Independent reports that a group of rabbis are starting a program to hide refugees in people's homes in Israel. The group, the Rabbis for Human Rights, have started the Anne Frank Home Sanctuary. Anne Frank was a Jewish teenager whose family hid for years in Amsterdam before they were caught by the Nazis. And Haaretz had this headline: Wajunga Muhammad is one African refugee Israel can't deport by force. He just killed himself. This young man was from Darfur in Sudan. You remember Darfur and all those crocodile tears that were shed for Darfur by the Israeli government when they thought they could use the issue as a club to embarrass Arabs. Yet for actual desperate people from Darfur, the Israeli government doesn't have an ounce of pity. The latest news about Ahed Tamimi. She was denied bail, this 16-year-old girl. She's already been in Israeli dungeons for a month for the immense crime of slapping an Israeli soldier. This is video from 2 years ago about Ahed Tamimi and others in her family when they rescued her brother.
اسمي عهد باسم محمد التميمي عمري 14 سنة. شفت الجندي برفع في أخوي محمد وبخبط فيه بالأرض. مسكت يد أخوي المكسورة عشان ما يصيرش فيها نسبة الكسور أعلى. ولا حدا يعني أصر علي إنه لازم أنزل بالمسيرة عشان أقاوم، بس أنا لما أشوف كل يوم مستوطن بيسبح بأرضي وقاعد في أرضي بيلعب وأنا خايفة إني أخسر حدا. بجاوب للناس اللي بيحكوا إنه ما فيش أمل، إنه طول ما في جيل زي جيلنا قادر إنه يثبت للاحتلال إنه هو أقوى منه، بضل يقاوم، أكيد في أمل إننا نتحرر.
Before we leave Israel, I want to bring up something that Norman Finkelstein said last week on Democracy Now! He and Amy Goodman were discussing the Trump plan to cut money from the U.S. to the UN Refugee Agency, UNRWA. Now, of course, that is obscene. The U.S. supports Israel fully in its siege on Gaza, so people cannot have anything like a normal economy, and they're desperate, and they have to rely on outside aid so they won't starve. So it's the least we can do to give them money for food. But listen to what Norman Finkelstein says.
I would like to keep things in proportion. So it would be a catastrophe, no doubt about it, if UNRWA is defunded by the United States. However, let's look at the numbers. We're talking about $300 million annually. Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, he paid $500 million for a yacht. That would have covered all of UNRWA's expenses, the American portion, for more than a year. He paid $450 million for a Da Vinci painting. That would have covered all U.S. expenses, again for more than a year. He paid $300 million for a house in Versailles. That would have covered all the UNRWA expenses by the United States.
he makes an excellent point. Even if the U.S. gave nothing, the Arab kings and emirs and such have immense amounts of money and could easily take care of Gaza. They do give a little, but nothing on like what they spend on themselves and on their hideous war on Yemen. Speaking of Yemen, you recall that last year, members of Congress tried to use the War Powers Act to stop all U.S. support for the terrible Saudi war on Yemen. The attempt failed when Democratic leaders joined with Republicans in derailing it. This week, a number of people sat in the office of Maryland Representative Steny Hoyer, the Democratic whip, who was one of the key players in setting aside House Concurrent Resolution 81. Here's a bit of the audio interview I did with one of the activists that Steny Hoyer had arrested. His name is Malachy Kilbride.
So let's describe what actually happened. So this was the 11th?
Yes, it was the same day in which many people were marking the 16th year, going into the 17th year of the prison camp in Guantanamo being open. So early in the morning, we joined our friends with Witness Against Torture, observing that tragic, outrageous day of 16 years of Guantanamo being open, going into 17 years. And then we made our way to Capitol Hill to Representative Steny Hoyer's office. And we went in, and there were about 12, maybe a little bit more of us, and we asked for a meeting, and we had a petition that has been signed by many people, and we asked to speak to someone in a policy making role, maybe somebody in foreign affairs or military affairs, and we were told there was no one who could see us. And essentially what we did was we stayed in the office from about 2:45 until about 7:30 at night. And at that, within an hour of that, the staffer said he was shutting the office up, and if we didn't leave, he was going to call the Capitol Hill police on us. And basically what we did was we told him he had to do what he had to do, and we had to do what we had to do. And so eventually the U.S. Capitol Police came, and they arrested us.
See the full interview at thestruggle.org. Click on the black button for our YouTube channel. You've all no doubt heard about the mistake in Hawaii when someone pressed the wrong button and sent panic through those who were told that a nuclear missile was incoming. It's actually worse. You see, there's no real button. It's a drop-down list on a computer screen. What happened was they sent the wrong message, and then they didn't have a message for canceling an incoming missile alert. Now, look here at this picture of the fixed computer screen. This is after they got it fixed. Notice on top there now is a choice for canceling and warning people that there was no real problem. But take a look at it. Notice the hodgepodge. People can use this screen for an Amber Alert, a high surf warning, a road closure, and PACOM. That's the alert that means a nuclear missile is inbound. Ridiculous. Accidents happen all the time. Systems are designed by people who may be brilliant or may be lazy or cheap. One such system is our nuclear war arsenal itself. Listen to an ex-nuclear war planner, Daniel Ellsberg. He tells about what he found when he became part of the Kennedy administration in 1961.
but I was given the job of improving the Eisenhower plans, which was not a very high bar, actually, at that time, because they were, on their face, the worst plans in the history of warfare. A number of people who saw them, but very few civilians ever got a look at them. In fact, the Joint Chiefs couldn't really get the targets out of General LeMay at the Strategic Air Command. And there was a good reason for that. They were insane. They called for first strike plans, which was by order of President Eisenhower. He didn't want any plan for limited war of any kind with the Soviet Union under any circumstances, because that would enable the army to ask for enormous numbers of divisions or even tactical nuclear weapons to deal with the Soviets. So he required that the only plan for fighting Soviets under any circumstances, such as an encounter in the Berlin corridor, the access to West Berlin, or over Iran, which was already a flashpoint at that point, or Yugoslavia, if they'd gone in. However the war started, with an uprising in East Germany, for example, however it got started, Eisenhower's directed plan was for all-out war in a first initiation of nuclear war, assuming the Soviets had not used nuclear weapons. And that plan called, in our first strike, for hitting every city, actually every town, over 25,000, in the USSR, and every city in China. A war with Russia would inevitably involve immediate attacks on every city in China. In the course of doing this, pardon, there were no reserves. Everything was to be thrown as soon as it was available. It was a vast trucking operation of thermonuclear weapons over to the USSR, but not only the USSR. The captive nations, the East Europe satellites in the Warsaw Pact, were to be hit in their air defenses, which were all near cities, their transport points, their communications of any kind. So they were to be annihilated as well. I couldn't believe when I saw these that the Joint Chiefs actually had ever calculated how many people they would actually kill in this course. In fact, colonels who were friends of mine in the air staff told me they'd never seen an actual figure for the total casualties. We had exact figures of the number of targets and how many planes would be needed and every sort of thing, many calculations, but not victims. So I drafted a question which the aide to McGeorge Bundy, Bob Comer, sent to the Joint Chiefs in the name of the President. And the question was, in the event of your carrying out your general nuclear war plans, which were first strike plans, how many will die? First, I asked, in the USSR and China alone. In the thought that, by the way, they'd be embarrassed to say, we have to have more time. We've never really calculated that. I was wrong, and my friends were wrong in the Air Force. They came back with an answer very quickly. 325 million people in the USSR and China alone. Well, then I asked, all right, how many altogether? And a few days later, 100 million in East Europe, the captive nations, another 100 million in West Europe, our allies, from our own strikes, by fallout, depending on which way the wind blew. And however the wind blew, a third 100 million in adjoining countries, neutral countries like Austria and Finland, or Afghanistan then, Japan, northern India, and so forth. A total of 600 million people. That was a time, by the way, when the population of the world was 3 billion. And that was an underestimate of their casualties, 100 holocausts.
100 holocausts. That was the one and only strategy of President Dwight Eisenhower. Well, that was decades ago. But listen to what Daniel Ellsberg says about the button and nuclear weapons today.
But the recent discussions of that, which emphasize his sole authority to do that, don't take account of the fact that he has authority to delegate. And he has delegated. Every president has delegated. I don't know the details of what President Trump has done, or since the Cold War. Every president in the Cold War, right through Carter and Reagan, had delegated, in fact, to theater commanders in case communications were cut off. That means that the idea that the president is the only one with sole power to issue an order that will be recognized as an authentic, authorized order is totally false.
So not only high-level commanders, but many lower-level military officers evidently have the power to deploy, to use nuclear weapons just on their own say-so. If you think this is all far-fetched, consider what Ellsberg tells us about an incident during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962.
You say the other thing I learned was that in the course of these maneuvers, we came within a hair's breadth of blowing the world up, of having the plans I've just described go into action. A nuclear submarine, I should say a submarine that was armed with nuclear torpedoes, had the two top commanders who thought they were going to go down, actually, as a result of these mock depth charges that were actually meant to force them to the surface. The commander, Savitsky, ordered the nuclear torpedo armed and ready for action against the destroyers or the cruiser. The second in command, whose assent was needed, agreed with him, and they were ready to go. It happened that a commodore of the several submarines in the area was on that sub rather than some other one. It could have been one of the others, but he was there, and since he was the commodore, his assent was also needed, and he said no. And thanks to that man, Vasily Arkhipov, we didn't blow a cruiser out of the water and cause the nuclear explosion that Kennedy had already announced would cause an all-out attack on the Soviet Union.
I've written a piece about all this on peacenews.org. It's called "The Need to Defy the Suicidal Logic of Nuclear War." In the illustration, the younger man in the vintage photograph is Vasily Arkhipov. He saved the world in 1962. The older man, of course, is Daniel Ellsberg today. Before leaving the question of nuclear weapons, we want to salute the leaders of North and South Korea who defied U.S. pressure and made an agreement to have a joint Olympic team at next month's Olympics. It's acts like this kind of defiance that will save us. Over the last few programs, we had the talk of Mark Bray about his book, Antifa. After he spoke, there was some interesting Q&A. I asked a question about last year's inauguration and the protests and the question of deliberate violence.
Right. So I'll just give a little more background on what happened, and then I'll talk about it. There was an anti-capitalist, anti-fascist demonstration on Trump's inauguration day on the 20th that included some targeted property destruction, and more than 200 people were arrested, some of them charged with property destruction, most of them charged not even with doing anything but attending the demonstration, facing in many cases as much as 75 years in prison, while, if my memory serves, the man who killed Ahed Tamimi is actually facing fewer years in prison, as a point of comparison. My best effort to interpret the rationale for the demonstration and the actions that I described was the following. If you have a situation where, as many people on the left and liberals have argued, you have someone who is, if not a fascist, then fascistic coming into power, and the ramifications of him being in power will probably include people dying from loss of health insurance, the destruction to the natural environment, et cetera, the rollback of civil liberties for large sectors of the population. What kind of political obligations do we have as those trying to resist those things to pull the emergency brake and say, not in our name? We will, of course, if we were to have that discussion, come to very different conclusions across the room. There's a range of things that can be done. But my interpretation of the intent of the organizers was to say that we need to make the Trump presidency unmanageable by making ourselves ungovernable, and therefore not allowing business as usual while this person is waltzing into the White House. Ultimately, whether or not you're sympathetic to that rationale will have a lot to do with what your politics are, with whether you have faith in the checks and balances of American government to yield decent results. But if you're skeptical of that, then maybe there are times when stepping out of the bounds of legality might be a useful political tactic.
That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Steny Hoyer for The Struggle.